Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa. Lisa, I have a question for you.
All right, I'm ready.
Do you consider yourself a crier?
Oh, actually, this is an interesting question because I did not ever used to consider myself a crier, and that has changed dramatically for me in probably the last 5 years. Now I would say, yes, I am definitely a crier, but I would say that for the first 37 years of my life, I did not consider myself a crier. So it's been an interesting shift for me that I do think I've become a lot more of a crier. Are you a crier?
I actually don't. I think I might consider myself sort of in the middle. Like, I think that I'm not somebody who cries a lot, but I'm also not somebody who's like afraid to cry. I think the things that I cry about are sort of weird sometimes. Like when I am fighting with somebody, when I'm arguing like with my husband or something, and I get like really like worked up and feel very strongly, I get so annoyed because that's when I'll start to cry and it'll impact my ability to communicate. And it's not because my feelings are hurt. It's because I'm like really worked up. And so in that moment, I don't think it actually expresses like what's going on for me, and it like gets in the way of my communication. And then things like if I go to one of my kids' chorus concerts or like musicals, when there's like a big musical number, I will always cry. I don't know what it is. I will always cry. And it might just be, I think that when you watch awe-inspiring music, a lot of the time it might give you chills or make you cry. And so that might have something to do with it. But I've always been very involved with like the music side of things at school, and my family has. So I'm like, is it have to do with that? I don't know. But yeah, like weird things get me. One of the things I love is when I cry because I'm laughing so hard. I did that yesterday and I love that, but it's rare. So yeah, I feel like I'm not afraid to cry, but it's not necessarily that I do when things like that I would think would make me cry happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And it's funny. I think I also have become a crier like when I get angry. Again, I've just become a crier like far more than I ever was. So as you were describing that first scenario of sort of like being worked up about something or being in a situation, an argument or something like that, that is a scenario where I don't think I ever used to be a crier in that situation, but now I am. I will like get so, and I totally agree that I will feel like this isn't reflective of what I'm feeling right now. Tears don't feel like the appropriate external demonstration of my sort of internal state. And yet that's what happens. And I do think I just cry. I think I do cry more now from things that would, I guess, where you would expect. I think I cry more about things that make me sad. And I don't know, situations. I do think I, in general, am more tearful than I used to be. It's interesting.
Do you have a theory about what shifted for you? Is it just, as we get older, our hormones change? Or
I mean, truly, I feel like, I do feel like I am at a point where like now anything, I'm like, is this perimenopause? This is probably perimenopause. Right. I'm like, I don't know. Yeah. That feels like what this must be. So I don't know. It may be that it is hormonal. It may be also like, I think that in the job that I had before What's Your Grief, like where we met, and the jobs I had before that, we worked with people in really intense crisis situations all the time. Like we weren't meeting people, like we were meeting people the day that their family members were in a devastating accident or that they were finding out, this was a non-survivable injury and those sorts of things. Before I worked in grief, I worked in homeless services for a really long time in Baltimore. And so everybody I met, oftentimes when they were like in crisis experiencing homelessness. And I think in some ways, not in a way where I feel like I was like compartmentalizing or dissociating or anything, but I just think in an adaptive way to be working in those situations all the time that I think I don't know that I like learned to, but I think that I just did feel like I sort of managed my tears more because I was really mindful that even though there were like many situations where I guess I wanted to cry, that I was really aware that my role was often to be the stability and support for somebody. And you never want on like the worst day of someone's life for them to feel like they're having to be aware of what your emotions are. So I do think that maybe in some ways that spilled over into other areas of my life too, that I was just more, I don't know, I just maybe managed it a little more. And now I think I don't try as hard not to cry. Like there are very few situations now where I'm like, if I want to cry, I will just like, I'm all in, I'm going to cry. I'm not going to try not to. If something has made me sad or if something is positive or wonderful or something that's really nice, like I just don't try to hold back tears, I think, the way that I used to. So I think maybe that's part of it too, is that I'm just more like, all right, if it's coming up, let's go.
That's really interesting. I think, where you were before, it wasn't necessarily like a place of discomfort with crying or anything. It was very kind of a practical approach to needing to sort of regulate what emotions you're showing on the outside. And now that that's not there anymore, you can kind of let that down. I think just this conversation and then some of what people are sharing in the chat, like acts of kindness can make me cry, things like that. It just kind of goes to show you that when we think about tears and crying, there are so many different things that crying means for people. There are so many different reasons people cry. There are so many different reasons why people don't cry. And it's so complex, just like all emotional expression is. But in our society, what do we typically think crying equals? Sadness, right? So we have this
completely.
we have this very simplistic view of crying, that we cry when we're sad, and when we're sad, we should cry, unless we are people who are not allowed to show our vulnerability, in which case we should not cry, right? And so I think that we have just such an oversimplistic view of it. And we really see this in grief, because the reason why I asked you this today is because we have questions. We often get questions around this, and we recently got a question about just like, why don't I cry when someone dies? Why am I somebody who's more on the outside, not showing a lot? And it may be that person asked this question because they typically never cry. It may be because they usually consider themselves somebody who does cry and they're not crying. And so it feels kind of disorienting. So we wanted to take a little time today just to talk about this and really normalize some of what people experience, whether they are crying or whether they're not, because in our society, what we often expect to see from people who are grieving is that they're sad and that they're crying. That is what is expected to be seen. And as we know, and as all of you have probably figured out by now, grief does not look one way. So we wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about this today.
Yeah. And actually, like, I think, and like, that is what people expect to see up until a certain point. Like, sure. The caveats we always say, I think I was thinking about this just last week. Was it last week? Yeah. I'm looking at the date right now. Yeah. A week ago today was would have been my dad's birthday. And I posted something about it on social media because it has been 25 years this year since my dad died, which is like one of those, I don't know, like all the numbers that feel like big numbers. And I was thinking about it and I posted something just like about the emotions that all still like come up around it and being like sort of teary around it. And I was thinking about that very thing of like how for so many people, like the bizarre misconceptions that somehow it would be abnormal to like still feel teary. And so I think it was part of the reason I was like, oh, I'm going to post this. It was like a
Yeah.
lot of times we do things that are more kind of informational or educational, but where I was like, oh no, it feels like I should share this because I do think there are a lot of people who maybe feel self-conscious, and they're like, okay, in the first year, everybody expects to see me crying. But then after that, everybody expects that like I should have turned that valve off and everything
Right.
should be different.
Yeah. Normalize crying. Even a
Normalize
year
crying.
after. Imagine that. Even 2 years, even 3 years,
5 years.
imagine.
Yeah, right.
So in talking about this today, I think it might be easiest if we just kind of like look at it kind of into maybe not categories, but just like we mentioned that there are people who typically don't cry. And so just talking about that quickly and then talking a little bit about if you are somebody who does and is all of a sudden finding themselves sort of cut off from that means of emotional expression that you typically connect with. I think maybe if we look at it those two ways, it might be kind of easier to talk about. And so just thinking about that first kind of category of people, there are a lot of people who don't typically tend to cry in many scenarios or in any scenarios. And I think that people who don't cry might expect, okay, well, if somebody dies, that will make me cry, right? Like if that doesn't make me cry, then I'm some kind of like monster or something. And I think that it's important to normalize that if you're not typically a crier and something big has happened, it doesn't necessarily all of a sudden mean that you're going to become one. Maybe you do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are all of a sudden going to be. And that doesn't mean that you're not grieving. I feel like we've talked about this so many times before, but there are lots of different ways that people grieve. And we've talked a lot about the intuitive and instrumental grievers, right? And there's one kind of way of grieving. It's really a spectrum, but on one end of the spectrum are people who are very emotional and show their emotion and talk about their emotion. But then on the other end of the spectrum are people who aren't.
Yeah, no, I think that sometimes when we look at that spectrum, sometimes people will assume, oh, those instrumental grievers, they want to be letting it out or they should be letting it out and like releasing these tears. And if that's not coming, that must be some sort of avoidance or repression or, and what we know is that that's not necessarily the case at all, that sometimes just the way those folks are processing is different. And it doesn't necessarily look like emotions coming out externally in that same way, like through tears. It isn't necessarily a sign that there's some sort of avoidance or repression that's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing is that in terms of grief experiencing, even grief processing, even grief expression, it looks different and the needs are getting met in different ways. So I think it's important for people to acknowledge there are many ways that people experience and express and explore and find constructive ways to cope with grief and to feel their grief.
And when you recognize, like, there's this added layer of the fact that there are also things that are, of course, very much socialized into us differently. Like there are different ways that the genders sometimes are socialized to grieve. There are ways culturally that there are differences around what people perceive as acceptable around crying on, again, all sorts of ends of the spectrum, with expectations about tears and expectations about no tears and all of that. And so I think the other thing that's important to think about with grief when things are coming up and we're trying to process and cope with something that is so unbelievably difficult, if we have some of those preconceived ideas about crying that have been socialized into us since a very young age in childhood, such that if we suddenly were to become a huge crier in a situation like this, where it would cause a real like dissonance or sort of distress around gender expectations or cultural norms or things like that, there's a lot of good, reasonable reasons that sometimes that isn't going to be what happens in grief. And that doesn't mean that maybe if you're feeling like you want to cry and some of this socialization may be what is making it hard for you to tap into those things. It's not to say that you shouldn't maybe try to create some space to explore crying, but it's also, I think, important to give ourselves a little bit of that self-compassion and understanding to say, like, if I've been socialized my whole life because of cultural norms, gender norms, other things that are going on in my life to feel a certain way about crying, it makes sense that when I'm already devastated by grief, I might not be in a place where I'm ready to violate all of those norms I've internalized since childhood.
Yeah, it's so interesting because for so many people, they have experiences like you're talking about, but then they get to this loss experience where all of a sudden the societal norm in expectation is to cry. So all of a sudden, they've been socialized all their life, some people to fear crying because it means they're weak or it means they're vulnerable or crying is going to mean that they're going to lose control. They've been socialized all their life to be one way in sort of kind of like a protective way, perhaps. And then all of a sudden, people are looking at them like, why aren't you doing this thing? This thing that you have
Yeah.
learned not to do because it makes you vulnerable or because it's threatening and it feels scary. So all of a sudden, not only are you going through loss, but people are looking at you, expecting you to experience this thing that you have kind of really distanced yourself from, or other people have kind of normalized distancing from. It's kind of a really interesting spot for people to sit in. So I agree. Having some self-compassion just for your own personal history and how you've been socialized, and understanding that you may have different ways, and maybe in the future you want to be able to get in touch with tears and things like that. And that's something to work through, but it's okay if you're not working through it in this moment, at the funeral or right after a person dies. You have enough
Yeah.
kind of on your plate. One thing that we do want to mention that's important, though, is that a benefit of crying is that it does signal to people that you are having an emotional experience, that you're maybe sad and need a little bit of support, perhaps. Crying can be something that can bring you closer to other people. And so, one thing that non-criers often unfortunately experience is a little less support from people, because what they're showing on the outside is not that they are struggling and need some support. Oftentimes what they're showing is that they are kind of have it together, and they are the ones who are maybe doing things and more practical and hands-on in their grieving. And so they're not always kind of sending that signal out to people that they need support, even though they have the same stuff going on the inside that people who are crying have going on. And so for people who are non-criers, just keep in mind, it might be important for you to actually express to people, maybe with your words, that you're struggling and that you need a little maybe compassion or patience or support, because people may not automatically triage that support to you. They may triage it to people who are a little more emotional on the outside.
Yeah, and I think this is true too when people's tearfulness starts to change in their grief, right? When like time passes and they realize, wow, earlier on everything was triggering tears, and maybe now I'm not as tearful in certain situations. And we hear from people all the time, right, who feel fearful that that will lead their support system to think like, oh, they're done grieving now. If I'm not
Right.
seeing them cry anymore, then their grief must be over. And there's a fear that that's what it will signal to people. And so sometimes in that situation too, it can be important to articulate even sort of that anxiety, to be able to say, like, I realize now I'm able to talk about things in a different way where I don't get as tearful or in certain situations. And I'm worrying that everybody is going to think that that means I'm fine or going to pull back on support. And I just like want you to know that I still feel like I need that support, even though maybe the tears aren't there in the same way. It can
Mhm.
sometimes help to reassure that it's okay if your relationship with crying has changed. You can still let people know you need support in other ways and that you're not like done grieving.
So the other category of questions we get are from people who typically would expect to cry because they maybe normally cry or they are comfortable with crying and that's something that they do often, or maybe they consider
Mhm.
themselves quote unquote a crier, they cry all the time. and they've experienced a loss, and all of a sudden they are feeling a little cut off from their emotion, and they're not experiencing the tears coming in the way that they thought they would. And this, I think, can cause people to feel a lot of different things. Some people may kind of feel that that would be a really helpful release to them, and they're not able to get that release. Some people may just wonder what's wrong with them because they aren't going to that place. And so I think it would be helpful probably to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the reasons why people may not cry in the way they expect to cry after a
Yeah.
loss.
Yeah. And the degree of like added level of self-judgment and confusion and distress that it can cause. You know, I think so much about, I'm sure you remember, like this was now 6 or 7 years ago. So we used to run a group in a low barrier homeless shelter in Baltimore. And I remember so well, there was a lady who came to our group week after week, month after month, whose daughter had died, and she had not experienced the tears that she expected, even though she had in other situations been a crier. And I think of her every time this topic comes up, because you could feel how present it was to her in her grief, the fact that she hadn't cried, because she couldn't make sense of it in connection with who she usually was, was, and why in other deaths she had cried. So I do think it's an important topic, and it's one that I know like it adds an extra layer to grief. And, you know, in her situation, one of the things we talked a lot about is one that comes to mind first for me with this, which is that oftentimes when we have other survival things that are just, when we look at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Our basic human needs, we have food and shelter, and again, taking care of like our children and their needs, potentially safety and security needs. All of those things are often so foundational for us. And when something devastating happens and we kick into that sort of stress response to try to make sure that we're safe, everyone around us is safe, are our bills getting paid, are we going to, you know, be able to maintain our jobs, like those sorts of things can really put our body into a stress response where it feels like, and it activates this place of like, okay, I've got to focus on survival. And when that happens, for some people, one of the things that can happen is, all right, tears, I don't have space for those right now, or that feels like it's not that kind of vulnerability that comes with tears, that isn't something that my brain is able to let in right now for whatever reason. And so sometimes we'll find that when people are in that place, it's harder for them to cry or kind of tap into that piece of things. And that can go on for quite a long time for some people. For some people, maybe it's not quite that high level of survival, but they realize that they felt like they were the only person in the family who was responsible for everything, the caregiving and funeral planning and, all of that. And so during that period, they will feel like I did not cry at all. Like I was just functioning in that mode of getting things done. But then sometimes the space does open up when those responsibilities are finished or changed, or we feel like we are navigating them okay. And so now there's more of a space that opens up. Sometimes that changes and tears do come in.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. You sort of touched on this, but I was thinking about this, especially when there are like adults caring for children who are affected by the loss. When we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sometimes we talk about in our parenting while grieving presentation how Maslow's hierarchy starts with like our basic needs, but if you're a parent, below that often starts with my kids' basic needs and my kids' feeling of being supported and loved and belonging. And so oftentimes I think with adults, they might kick into this mode of being like, I cannot cry, especially if we associate crying with being something that's scary or means that we're weak. We think we cannot show this to our kids because that's going to scare them. And what we know is that we can cry in front of our kids. We can have conversations with kids about what tears mean. Kids cry all the time, so they know what it feels like. And so we can certainly have those conversations and show them emotion. But parents often do kind of kick into that gear of like, I can't I can't experience my emotion right now. I can't show them my emotion. And what some of the data that we present when we talk up to people about parenting while grieving and supporting grieving children is that sometimes kids reciprocate that in a sense, and they say, well, I can't cry in front of my parents. I can't show them how upset I am because they're already dealing with so much. I don't want to cause additional ripples. So sometimes people just kick into these modes. And like you said, sometimes a space opens up, but sometimes we really do kind of kick into this mode and sort of stay there, especially if we establish these kind of cultures of silence in our family around these things. Or if we start to go to a place chronically of avoidance. In the beginning, sometimes we have to avoid some of those things that feel very emotional for those adaptive reasons, like you described, Lisa. Like we have to get through all these things. We feel like we're the person who has to support everybody or do everything. And oftentimes that's very temporary and it's very adaptive. But if avoidance becomes this chronic thing where we're consistently avoiding maybe reminders of the person or being alone because then we know we have to like face our feelings, or going to maybe a support group or talking to somebody who is close to the loss because we know it's going to come up and we fear what will happen. If we're chronically avoiding, that's when we might want to take a look at that, because that might be one of the reasons why we're not really kind of getting in touch or experiencing some of those emotional responses that we would have expected to. And we may not even fully realize we're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's tricky, is that sometimes with some of these, it's not that there's a conscious awareness of it necessarily. Like if you're someone who has always been a crier and comfortable with crying, there may be a piece of you that has felt like in the past there has never been anything that you have sort of felt the intensity of emotion as with this loss. And so in those other contexts, maybe there on some level was a feeling of like, well, okay, I know that I can cry and then I can, let that wave come and pass and be on the other side of those tears and be able to keep moving forward with things. When the intensity of grief and the emotions that come with loss are just so overwhelming and maybe unlike anything you've ever experienced before, I think one thing that can happen too subconsciously is a little bit of fear of our own emotions and fear of opening up tears in a new way, because there's this feeling of like, I don't know that I will ever be able to stop. Like, I don't know that I will be able to sort of manage my tears in the same way as before, or ride that wave. Like all those tears of the past feel like nothing compared to what I have to cry about now. And I don't know that that's always a conscious thing, but I think sometimes our appraisal of our ability to cope and manage may be different in the face of this loss. And that for some people, that fear means that they kind of pull away from tears. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that it can be good to check in with yourself about, to see if that's something that maybe on some level is happening, because there are things we can do to start to build a little bit more confidence. Again, that we don't have to be scared of our emotions. Yeah. We don't have to be terrified that if we let a few of those tears out, that it means that we'll never be able to get things under control again. But it does take a little work sometimes to do that.
Yeah. And talking about those intense experiences, those intense emotional experiences, avoidance, fear, things like that, it reminds me of how some people have such intense experiences, sometimes traumatic experiences, and then such intense grief that follows, that sometimes what we're experiencing isn't like a moment of things subsiding, like we think they're going to subside, that acute stress subsiding, that anxiety subsiding. Sometimes things feel like they stay quite heightened. And so we might see that somebody really, instead of focusing on the sadness, really goes to a place of focusing a lot on anxiety. And that's what they're really experiencing very intensely. If there was a potentially traumatic experience, a person might be experiencing some more trauma-like responses, and that crying might be a part of that, or it might not be a part of that. And then, of course, one of the major features of depression is that experience that they call anhedonia, where you are just kind of feel nothing. Like it's just a numb experience where you're kind of just, you lose that ability to feel pleasure and things like that. in the things you once did. And sometimes you feel like you've lost the ability to feel those tears as well. It's like, it's very disorienting. It's hard to explain to people how feeling nothing could feel absolutely terrible, but it does. And so I think something to consider is that sometimes we do see people experiencing things that feel a little bit like some of those things that are a little more intense and extreme, and don't wind up in somebody having like the space and time to like process and cry and things like that, because they are experiencing something so intense like anxiety or traumatic stress or even depression.
Yeah, I think that when you look as well as the fact that early on, for some people, that reason the tears aren't coming can be because of that shock and numbness and disbelief. And, for some of those, there's so many reasons that that may be part of our response to loss. And that can last for a while. Yeah. And then sometimes that can shift once we're shifting away from maybe that shock and that numbness that's coming from the shock. Sometimes then we can end up in a place where we're really having depression come up or post-traumatic stress come up, or, again, other things that may be pulling us in a direction that doesn't just look tearful. So, it does get complicated, and it can be a place where I think if you are feeling that feeling of, wow, it has been 6 months, 9 months, a year, and I have felt numb, detached, that anhedonia feeling. I don't know that I have ever really kind of felt those feelings coming in. That is a point where it can be really important to talk to a mental health professional, get going and just have an assessment with somebody that may help to figure out, would a little bit of support help you in some of those situations.
Yeah. I think the tricky thing in talking about things like anxiety and depression is that we just know that they're so common in general. So it just makes sense that people who are grieving will experience them. A certain percentage of people will experience them. And also sometimes a loss is something that can trigger those types of things. It's tricky though, because we know that grief can look a lot like so many of these different things. And a lot of the responses that are expected in grief are things that might look like those different experiences like anxiety and depression. That's more kind of in the disordered, I don't know. I never know what word I like it.
They're all awful. Disordered, pathological.
Yeah, it's just they all feel wrong. So like you said, Lisa, we're always the first to say, if you're feeling something that feels very distressing to you, very disorienting, not what you would expect, it really never hurts if you have access to a therapist. If you don't, looking into how you can get access. There are people out there who have like sliding scales, and there are resources out there for people who maybe don't have insurance for therapy, things like that. If you can get in contact with a mental health person and maybe talk about some of this stuff, it can just help to sort through some of this and to really be able to identify like, what is at the heart of this? What am I experiencing? And how can I constructively cope with some of these things? What we know is that coping with grief is so complex, it's so ongoing, and we need so many different tools to deal with it. And so having somebody to help us navigate that is never a bad thing.
It can also just sometimes help to normalize that maybe this is just that you're somebody where tears, for whatever reason, haven't been present in your grief, not because it seems like there is something bigger or more concerning going on. It isn't necessarily that avoidance or a sign of some sort of other mental health issue happening. And if that's the case, of just building that self-compassion, of being able to, again, go back to something we talk about so often, which is like, just how do I approach whatever my grief responses are from a place of non-judgment, assuming that they're not things that are harming me, responses that are harming me, but being able to just be a little bit more open to that possibility that there's just such a big spectrum. It's not necessarily going to look like we predicted. It's not necessarily going to look like it looked in past losses, or it's not necessarily going to look like it looks for the people around us. And then how can we just get to that place of being a little bit more kind to ourselves, rather than having these moments of beating ourselves up for why am I not crying, or why am I crying so much, or all the things
Yeah.
that can happen where we start to make that part of the issue.
We've talked a little bit about shock and numbness, and I think that those are things that can happen at any loss, but I think they're a little more typical when a loss is sudden. And so, one
Mhm.
thing that I did also want to mention is just how the experience of anticipatory grief can impact a person. I think often think that after a loss, things will look a certain way. We will experience emotion in a certain way, and I don't know what that's based on, what we saw on television and in movies. Maybe it's based on these ideas about these stages of grief and things like that. But one of the things that often those conceptualization doesn't take into account is that for many people, there's anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief is something we experience when we know that a person is going to die. So an example of this would be if they're terminally ill, maybe they have something like cancer, and we know that they're going to die. As soon as we know that that is a significant possibility, we start to grieve pieces of that loss that come up for us. And so oftentimes people are crying and processing and experiencing losses well before the person actually dies. And this doesn't mean that they grieve any less. It just looks a little different than, quote unquote, the typical, right? And so something to consider is that oftentimes people have done a lot of crying before the loss. And then when the loss happens, they may not have that big emotional release or cry because they have been processing this and doing whatever emotional experiences and expression makes sense. And that might have been crying really leading up to the death for a long time.
Yeah, that's, I think, very, very true. And I think it's interesting because oftentimes some people will experience that where there have been a lot of tears before, and then it's sort of a surprise to them when there aren't more tears after the death happens. But I think you're right that it's absolutely because some of that is happening in the anticipation of the loss. But I think on the other side of it too, it's important to say that sometimes that's not what happens. Sometimes people will say, I thought that I had sort of cried all of my tears before the death, or I thought I'd done all this pre-grieving so that it wasn't going to be such a flood afterwards. And sometimes it still is. So that's just to say, again, with anticipatory grief, that can absolutely be one of the reasons that you're not as tearful as you expect after the death. And also, if you anticipated the death and you were still really tearful, that's totally normal too. Lots of people find that they thought they'd cried all the tears beforehand, and there's a whole new wave of tears that come after.
Sure. And there are still things that don't sink in right away with anticipatory grief that take a long time to feel real. So I think the main thing I want people to take is that it looks different than maybe a lot of people expect going into grief and loss. There are so many different ways that this looks and feels. The last thing that I can think of, maybe you have something else to add, but is last week we talked a little bit about grieving relationships that are sort of complicated. And this is like a small one to add, but I think oftentimes people think if anyone dies, if I'm at any funeral, if I'm a good person, I'll cry. And I do think that sometimes we just don't have that kind of relationship with a person that we would feel affected in that way. And your friend who maybe had a same, like similarly distant relationship might be the type of person who does cry at every funeral or whenever anyone dies. And maybe that's not you, and that's okay. So there are times when we feel like we should be crying, but perhaps the relationship for a lot of reasons doesn't kind of warrant it. Maybe we weren't that close to them and kind of only casually knew the person. Maybe we did have a really complicated relationship with the person. And so the emotions that are coming up for us look different than we might have expected. They don't look like sadness and crying. They look like a lot of other things. And we may be surprised by that. But just to say that sometimes the relationship isn't one that's going to make you feel tears. It might make you feel other things.
Yeah, I think that you sort of pointed to it of saying it could be family, but reminding yourself too, when we say that you didn't have that type of relationship, maybe you didn't know them well, that can include family. Sometimes I think we have this idea that especially if it's biological family, that it is always going to be something that is going to be a really emotional or tearful experience. But there are plenty of situations where maybe we, have a sibling who we really aren't that close to and don't have that strong of a relationship with. And, we find that we're not as tearful as we expect and, beat ourselves up because how could I be somebody who's like not crying when my sibling has died? But, understanding that our grief, it often is a reflection of the relationship that was going on when the person was alive. And so it's absolutely okay to see that whole spectrum of what it might look like,
Yeah,
when they're
it
gone.
might the emotions that might be coming up might feel more like anger or something else. Okay, so we've written a couple of articles about all of this, including one that's about getting kind of more in touch with your grief. If you're feeling like you want to be able to get more in touch with your emotions or cry, and that's a place you're not in. So we can link to all of those different articles about this. And as always, you can feel free to reach out to us at What's Your Grief. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and you can always email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com.